When you think of Benjamin Franklin, you might picture a statesman, an inventor, or a writer. But behind every achievement was something far simpler: his daily routine. Franklin believed that the way he spent his hours shaped not only his own success, but even the future of his young nation. He planned his mornings with questions, filled his afternoons with work, and ended his nights with reflection. His routine was not grand or dramatic, but steady, thoughtful, and quietly powerful. Tonight, we will step into Franklin's world, moving hour by hour through the rhythm of his days, and discover how ordinary habits became extraordinary over time. And before we begin this journey together, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps keep these calming stories alive. Benjamin Franklin's mornings began not with chaos or hurry, but with a question. As dawn broke and the soft light of Philadelphia filtered through shutters, he asked himself, "What good shall I do today?" It was a question that anchored his daily life, a ritual as important as breakfast or work. To understand Franklin's daily routine is to begin here, in the quiet of the morning, when the day was still unshaped and possibility stretched before him like a blank page. Franklin believed mornings were sacred hours. He did not treat them as empty space before work, but as the foundation of the day. Rising early was, for him, not a punishment, but an opportunity. He often woke at 5, when the streets outside were still hushed, when only the faint sound of roosters or distant footsteps stirred the air. This stillness allowed him to gather his thoughts, to prepare himself not only for tasks but for purpose. The question he asked was not about profits or recognition, but about goodness. What good, large or small, could he bring into the world before night returned? He began by tending to his body. A believer in moderation, Franklin did not overindulge in food or drink, but preferred a simple meal that would fuel his energy without dulling his mind. Sometimes bread and milk, sometimes a light broth, enough to sustain, never to weigh him down. He saw meals not as indulgence, but as part of his discipline, each choice a reflection of his larger philosophy: balance, temperance, order. Eating simply freed time and focus for higher aims. Next came attention to cleanliness and dress. Franklin wrote often about the virtues of order, and he practiced it in his appearance. His grooming was not vanity, but discipline, a way of aligning the outer with the inner. He washed, dressed, and set himself in order, for he believed that to face the world disheveled was to bring disorder into one's mind. Cleanliness, for him, was a virtue not only of the body but of the spirit, a small daily step toward clarity. With body tended and mind alert, Franklin turned to study. His mornings were filled with reading and reflection, a time when he absorbed knowledge and sharpened thought. Books were his constant companions, not only works of science and philosophy, but also history, poetry, and the wisdom of other cultures. He copied passages, noted observations, and allowed ideas to mingle in his mind. He knew that invention and leadership did not spring from thin air, but from the slow accumulation of thought, the careful layering of learning over time. By giving his mornings to study, he invested in the future of his day and of his life. Franklin also used these hours to review his schedule. He was famously devoted to the idea of order, creating charts and tables that mapped out his days and weeks. In these pages, he listed his virtues, tracked his progress, and noted his failings. His morning review was not harsh self-criticism, but gentle correction, a way of steering himself back onto the path he had chosen. He saw life as improvable, and mornings were his workshop for that improvement. Each new dawn offered a chance to begin again, to do better, to align his actions with his ideals. Central to this practice was the question itself: what good shall I do today? This was not idle musing. It was a challenge, a vow, and a guiding star. For Franklin, goodness was not abstract, but practical. It might mean helping a neighbor, improving his business, advancing science, writing a useful essay, or mentoring a younger colleague. It might mean small courtesies, kindness to strangers, honesty in dealings, punctuality in appointments. He believed that goodness was built from small acts as much as great deeds, and by asking this question each morning, he reminded himself that each hour carried opportunity. The mornings also carried a sense of calm routine. Franklin's writings suggest he valued predictability, the reassurance that comes from structure. By rising early, eating simply, studying, and reflecting, he built a rhythm that freed him from distraction. He did not need to waste energy deciding what to do. The pattern guided him. This structure, far from being a prison, gave him freedom. It allowed his mind to focus on higher questions, on invention, on civic duty, on personal growth. He understood that greatness is built not from chaos, but from steady habits, repeated day after day. Outside, Philadelphia was stirring by the time Franklin finished his morning practices. Apprentices hurried to shops, merchants opened shutters, carts rolled down cobblestones. Franklin, too, would step into this world, carrying with him the calm and clarity of his morning. He was ready not just to earn a living, but to shape a life. For his daily question reminded him that each hour mattered, that each task carried meaning. What makes Franklin's morning so remarkable is not that it was filled with extraordinary acts, but that it was filled with ordinary ones, given extraordinary intention. Rising early, eating simply, dressing neatly, reading, reflecting, none of these are unusual. But by framing them with the question of goodness, Franklin transformed them. He made mornings not just preparation for life, but part of life itself, lived fully, with awareness and purpose, and so, day after day, the rhythm repeated. Dawn arrived, the question was asked, the body and mind prepared, the study undertaken, the reflection made. Franklin's greatness did not come from occasional brilliance, but from this steady cultivation. He tended to his days as a gardener tends to soil, knowing that growth comes slowly, quietly, with care. His morning question was the seed, and from it grew a life that would shape history. For us, reading his routine centuries later, there is something both calming and inspiring in this practice. To imagine Franklin at his desk, pen in hand, candle burning low, asking himself not what he would gain, but what good he would do. It is to see a model of intention. It reminds us that history is shaped not only by battles and speeches, but also by mornings, by questions asked in the quiet hours, by choices repeated faithfully, and perhaps, as we picture him beginning his day, we hear an echo for our own. The question need not be Franklin's alone. It can belong to anyone willing to greet the morning with purpose. What good shall I do today? After Benjamin Franklin greeted the morning with his quiet question, "What good shall I do today?" he turned to the heart of his day, work. For Franklin, work was not a burden to be endured, but a discipline to be cultivated, a rhythm that gave shape to hours and meaning to life. He believed in order, in structuring time so that labor and leisure alike found their proper place. To understand his afternoons is to see how he merged business, invention, and civic duty into a seamless whole, guided by an almost musical sense of timing and balance that Franklin's profession as a printer demanded precision. The shop was both noisy and methodical, alive with the clatter of type, the smell of ink, and the creak of the press. Apprentices and journeymen bustled about, setting letters into lines, inking forms, laying paper, and pulling impressions. Franklin himself had trained in this craft from boyhood, his hands as familiar with type cases as with quills. By the time he ran his own shop in Philadelphia, he was master of the process. Yet he did not see printing merely as a trade. He saw it as a calling. Through print, ideas traveled, knowledge spread, and communities found their voice. Each sheet that left his press carried not only words but influence, a chance to shape thought and conversation. The discipline of hours guided his shop. Franklin divided his day with care, devoting blocks of time to work, study, correspondence, and reflection. He drew charts of his schedule, mapping when he would labor, when he would read, when he would rest. This habit did not arise from obsession but from practicality. He believed time, like money, should be accounted for, invested wisely, and never wasted. A day scattered in idleness was a day lost. A day structured was a day gained. To work with discipline was to live with purpose. But Franklin's work was never confined to printing alone. His restless curiosity pushed him constantly into invention. He was not content simply to produce newspapers or pamphlets. He wanted to improve the very conditions of life. And so, within the discipline of his hours, he carved space for experiments. One day it might be electricity, with sparks leaping from Leyden jars. Another day it might be a new design for a stove, intended to warm homes more efficiently. Or it might be the invention of bifocal glasses, so that aging eyes could see both near and far without strain. Each invention grew from his habit of asking questions, of testing ideas, of devoting steady hours to curiosity. What is striking is not that Franklin was occasionally brilliant, but that he was consistently diligent. His discoveries did not appear suddenly. They were the fruit of hours managed carefully, of time given to exploration, of discipline applied to curiosity. He showed that invention is not only inspiration but also routine, a matter of showing up each day, of tending to questions patiently, of giving them room to grow within the structure of a life that Franklin's discipline extended beyond his personal work. He devoted hours to civic projects, believing that the good of the community was inseparable from the good of the individual. He organized libraries so that knowledge could be shared, fire brigades so that disasters could be prevented, and learned societies so that minds could meet. Each of these efforts required not only vision but time, hours set aside from business, carved from personal comfort, devoted to building something larger. By treating civic duty as part of his daily schedule, Franklin showed that public service was not occasional charity but regular practice. Even his correspondence reflected this discipline. Letters were an essential part of his day, and he managed them with care. Whether writing to family, friends, or colleagues abroad, Franklin used his letters to exchange ideas, to share observations, to maintain connections that stretched across continents. He believed words carried power, and he gave them time and attention. A letter written in Philadelphia might inspire an experiment in London, or spark a new project in Paris. The steady rhythm of correspondence kept him connected, allowing his influence to spread far beyond his own city. Franklin also believed in efficiency within work. He disliked wasted effort, whether in business or invention. His stove was designed to burn less fuel, his bifocals to reduce the need for multiple pairs of glasses, his civic projects to prevent problems before they grew costly. In his printing, he sought clarity and simplicity, preferring straightforward prose to ornament. This love of efficiency was not cold calculation, but a desire to free time and energy for better use. If less effort could yield more result, then more hours could be devoted to goodness, knowledge, and service. And yet, within his discipline, Franklin left room for flexibility. He understood that not every hour could be perfectly controlled, that life brought interruptions, surprises, and demands. The discipline of hours was a guide, not a chain. If opportunity arose to help a neighbor, to experiment with an idea, to meet with friends, he allowed himself to step aside from his chart. But because the rest of his day was structured, these deviations did not lead to chaos. They became intentional choices, absorbed into the larger order of his life. The afternoons, then, were not simply hours of labor. They were the canvas on which Franklin painted his life's variety: printing, invention, civic duty, correspondence, and reflection. Each block of time was purposeful, each activity chosen, each hour invested. His discipline did not rob life of spontaneity. It gave spontaneity room to flourish within a framework that ensured progress. He proved that structure is not the enemy of creativity, but its partner. That order and imagination can live side by side, each nourishing the other. For us, looking back, Franklin's discipline of hours carries a lesson as gentle as it is profound. Greatness is not built in bursts of brilliance alone, but in the steady management of days. It is in the willingness to rise early, to devote time to labor, to give space to curiosity, to serve community, to write letters, to improve systems. It is in the quiet discipline of honoring each hour, of asking not only what must I do, but also what good can be done in this time. As the afternoon sun slanted across the cobblestones of Philadelphia, Franklin's shop continued its rhythm. Presses thumped, apprentices scurried, ink-stained fingers and sleeves. But behind this bustle lay a deeper order, the discipline of hours, the structure of a life guided by purpose. Franklin's days remind us that even the busiest schedules can be sanctuaries of meaning when guided by intention, that hours become more than numbers when invested with care, and that work itself, approached with balance, can be both duty and joy. And so, in the steady labor of Franklin's afternoons, in the pages pressed, the letters written, the experiments begun, the civic projects planned, we glimpsed not only the man but the philosophy, that life, divided and tended like a well-kept garden, yields fruit not only for the self but for the world. His discipline of hours was not rigidity, but harmony, a rhythm that made each day a step towards something larger, something lasting. For Benjamin Franklin, leisure was not the absence of work, but the companion of it. He believed that hours spent in rest and conversation, when approached with intention, were as valuable as hours spent in the printing shop or at the writing desk. To him, leisure was not wasted time, but cultivated time, a chance to refresh the mind, to nourish curiosity, and to deepen the bonds of friendship and community. His daily routine, carefully structured though it was, always left room for leisure, for he understood that a life lived only in toil was incomplete, just as a life lived only in idleness was unfulfilled. Balance was the key, and Franklin's way of leisure reveals as much about his character as his work. Franklin cherished conversation. In taverns, coffee houses, and private parlors, he found joy in the company of others, in the exchange of ideas, in the rhythm of voices rising and falling. He was not content with shallow chatter, though he enjoyed wit and humor as much as anyone. He sought discussions that sharpened thought, that tested arguments, that revealed new perspectives. A single evening in conversation could be, for him, as fruitful as a day of study, for it allowed him to see the world through the minds of others. One of Franklin's greatest inventions was not a machine, but a gathering, the Junto, a club he founded in 1727 for mutual improvement. It was a small society of artisans, tradesmen, and thinkers who met weekly to discuss morals, politics, philosophy, and business. Each member brought questions, essays, or observations, and together they debated with vigor but also respect. The Junto was leisure and work entwined, conversation elevated into a practice of self-improvement and civic growth. To sit in those meetings, to hear Franklin and his companions discuss questions of virtue, invention, and community, was to experience the joy of curiosity in its purest form. Leisure for Franklin also meant reading. Books were his constant refuge, companions that spoke silently across centuries and oceans. He read widely, never confining himself to a single field. Science, history, literature, philosophy, travel, all found their way into his library and his mind. For him, leisure reading was not escape but engagement. Each book was a doorway to new thought, each page a conversation with the past. He read not to pass time, but to enrich it, to feed the curiosity that never left him. Yet Franklin was not only a reader, but a writer in leisure. His essays, witty and sharp, often began as exercises in reflection, written not for fame, but for clarity. He delighted in the play of words, in the shaping of argument, in the humor of satire. Writing was for him both work and leisure, a practice that brought joy even as it demanded discipline. The line between labor and play blurred, for curiosity made even effort delightful. Music also colored Franklin's leisure. He played instruments, sang, and composed, finding in sound another avenue of expression. To sit at a harpsichord, to pluck the strings of a guitar, to join voices in song, these moments refreshed him, reminded him that beauty was as necessary as logic. That harmony was not only a principle of music, but of life. He even invented the glass harmonica, a delicate instrument of spinning glass bowls, whose ethereal tones enchanted listeners across Europe. This invention was born not of necessity, but of curiosity and play, a gift of leisure transformed into art. Franklin's joy of curiosity extended beyond rooms and books into the world itself. He loved to walk, to observe, to ask questions of the environment around him. Why did a storm move as it did? How did a kite behave in the wind? Why did a stove warm a room inefficiently? Each observation became the seed of an experiment or an idea. For Franklin, leisure did not mean passivity, but attentiveness. The world was a book, and he was always reading it, always curious, always open to discovery. Even in company, his leisure reflected this curiosity. He asked questions more than he gave answers, drawing out the knowledge of others. He believed that conversation was not a contest to be won, but a field to be cultivated. By listening as much as speaking, he allowed ideas to grow, friendships to deepen, respect to flourish. People were drawn to him not only for his wit, but for his attentiveness, the way he made others feel heard, valued, and part of something larger. Leisure for Franklin also carried a moral dimension. He believed that play without purpose led to waste, but play guided by curiosity and conversation led to improvement. This did not mean he scorned relaxation. He enjoyed meals with friends, laughter in taverns, games, and lighthearted diversions. But even these moments reflected his philosophy. Joy was not separate from virtue, but part of it. To laugh together, to share stories, to enjoy company was itself a kind of good, a way of weaving community, of strengthening bonds that made society resilient. His evenings often ended with reflection. After the work, the study, the conversations, the laughter, he asked himself a final question. What good have I done today? This was leisure too, though of a different kind. Not play, but contemplation. It was a quiet pause, a turning back over the hours to see what they had yielded, to measure not wealth or fame but goodness. To end the day in this way was to close the circle begun in the morning, to find harmony in the balance of action and reflection. What makes Franklin's approach to leisure so striking is how seamlessly it wove into his life of work. He did not divide the two as opposites. Work fed leisure. Leisure fed work. Conversation inspired essays. Essays inspired inventions. Inventions enriched life. Reading nourished his thought. Music refreshed his spirit. Reflection guided his choices. For Franklin, leisure was not escape from life, but part of living well, a necessary rhythm that gave energy to labor and depth to achievement. Looking back, his joy of curiosity seems almost inexhaustible. Whether in a workshop, a library, a tavern, or a garden, Franklin found ways to ask questions, to listen, to learn. His daily routine was not a prison of schedules, but a framework that allowed curiosity to flourish in all its forms. Leisure was not idleness, but attention, not withdrawal, but engagement. It was, for Franklin, the art of living fully, of savoring hours as much as filling them. And so, in his evenings of conversation, in his hours of reading, in his experiments born of play, in his music, in his laughter, Franklin reveals a truth both calming and profound. That greatness is not forged in labor alone, but in the joy of curiosity, the leisure that refreshes the mind, the conversations that knit people together, the simple pleasures that remind us of what it means to be human. When the long hours of Benjamin Franklin's day drew toward evening, the rhythm of his routine did not end with labor or conversation. Instead, it turned inward, toward reflection. For Franklin, the closing hours of the day were as important as its beginning, for they completed the circle of intention and fulfillment. Just as his mornings began with a question, "What good shall I do today?" his evenings ended with another, "What good have I done today?" This quiet inquiry became the anchor of his nights, a moment of honesty with himself, and a practice that revealed the depth of his philosophy of life. As the lamps were lit and the bustle of the city faded into softer tones, Franklin withdrew from the noise of shops and streets into the stillness of his own space. His evenings were not meant for frantic activity, but for calm review. He believed that the day should be measured not in wealth earned, tasks completed, or recognition gained, but in goodness, in the contributions made to others, in the improvement of self, in the quiet progress toward virtue. The question of goodness was not vague but practical, requiring him to look back upon each hour and ask, "Did my actions align with my values?" Franklin's devotion to self-examination was not casual. He kept a notebook in which he charted his progress against a list of 13 virtues he had set for himself: temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, moderation, cleanliness, tranquility, chastity, and humility. Each evening, he reviewed his day against these virtues, marking where he had succeeded and where he had failed. The practice was humbling, for no day was ever perfect. Yet Franklin did not seek perfection in a single day. He sought improvement across a lifetime, believing that small corrections, repeated faithfully, could shape character as surely as steady chiseling shapes stone. This nightly ritual of review was a form of discipline, but also a form of rest. By writing down his failings and acknowledging them, he freed his mind from the burden of unspoken guilt. By noting his successes, he gave himself quiet encouragement. The act of reflection turned his day into a lesson, his life into a series of experiments in living. Each evening was a chance to gather wisdom from the hours that had passed, to prepare for a better morning yet to come. Evenings also allowed Franklin to turn his attention to correspondence. With the clamor of the shop behind him, he took time to compose letters to friends, family, colleagues, and fellow thinkers abroad. These letters were more than communication. They were extensions of reflection. He shared observations, tested ideas, and sometimes confessed struggles. Writing at night, he gave his thoughts permanence, sending them out into the world to travel farther than he himself could go. In this way, his evenings extended his reflection beyond the self, turning private insight into shared knowledge. There was also a contemplative quality to Franklin's evenings that went beyond writing. He often sat quietly with books, reviewing passages he had marked earlier or considering ideas that lingered from conversations and experiments. Books, for him, were companions in reflection, voices that reminded him of the wisdom of ages, of the struggles of others, of the continuity of human thought. By reading at night, he connected his own day to the larger story of humanity, situating his life within the flow of time. Franklin also believed in ending the day with gratitude. While his written virtues stressed order and frugality, his heart leaned toward appreciation. To acknowledge the good he had done was also to acknowledge the good done by others, the kindness of a friend, the diligence of an apprentice, the wisdom found in a book. Gratitude softened the sharpness of self-criticism, reminding him that life was not only about striving, but also about receiving and recognizing blessings. What makes Franklin's evenings so compelling is how ordinary they were in form, yet extraordinary in effect. Reflection, reading, writing, gratitude. These are simple acts, available to anyone. Yet by practicing them faithfully, Franklin turned them into instruments of growth. He did not let his days blur into one another without pause or meaning. Instead, he gathered each day, held it up to the light, and asked what it had yielded. In doing so, he gave shape not only to his time, but to his character. His evening question, "What good have I done today?" also carried a social dimension. It reminded him that life was not lived in isolation. Goodness was measured not only by personal discipline, but by the impact on others. Did he contribute to his community? Did he serve knowledge, friendship, justice? The question forced him to look outward even as he looked inward, linking personal virtue with public responsibility. For Franklin, a day could not be judged truly good unless it had rippled beyond himself. Even in leisure, the question lingered. If he spent the evening in music, conversation, or lighthearted diversion, he asked whether it had strengthened bonds, lifted spirits, refreshed minds. If so, it counted as good. If it had descended into waste or harm, it was marked as failing. This gentle but persistent awareness infused even his pleasures with meaning, ensuring that joy and virtue walked hand in hand. As night deepened, Franklin sought tranquility. He valued rest as much as work, believing that sleep was a duty to the body and mind. By closing his day with reflection, he cleared the clutter of thought, allowing himself to rest without regret or turmoil. Sleep, then, became not an escape but a continuation of his discipline, a time for renewal, preparing the soil for the next morning's question. Looking back, Franklin's evenings reveal the essence of his philosophy, that life is a continual experiment, a cycle of questioning, acting, reflecting, and beginning again. The morning asked for intention. The evening asked for accountability. Together, they framed his days in purpose, ensuring that hours were not lost but lived. He knew that greatness is not found only in grand achievements, but in the quiet accumulation of good days. Each one examined, each one refined. And so, in the dim light of his chamber, pen in hand, notebook open, Franklin ended his day not with applause or distraction, but with a simple question that still resonates across centuries. What good have I done today? In that question lies the heart of his routine, the wisdom of his discipline, and the legacy of a life shaped not by chance, but by choice, not by chaos, but by reflection. Benjamin Franklin often said that the key to a good life was balance. Not the rigid balance of a scale frozen in place, but the living balance of a body in motion, always adjusting, always steadying itself even as it moved forward. In his daily routine, this philosophy appeared clearly. He did not live only for work, nor only for leisure. He did not neglect rest in pursuit of ambition, nor did he sacrifice virtue for ease. Instead, he sought to weave these elements together so that each supported the others. The balance of work, rest, and virtue was the quiet structure of his days, and it remains one of the most revealing aspects of his life. Work, for Franklin, was essential, but it was not everything. He valued industriousness, the steady application of effort to useful tasks, as one of his highest virtues. In his little book of self-improvement, he devoted entire columns to tracking whether he had wasted time or failed to apply himself. He knew that industry built wealth, reputation, and opportunity, but he also believed that work should serve a purpose beyond personal gain. Printing was not only a trade to him, it was a way of spreading knowledge. Invention was not only curiosity, it was a way of improving daily life. Civic projects were not only duties, they were gifts to his community. By grounding work in usefulness, Franklin gave it dignity, making even the humblest tasks part of a larger vision. Yet he also recognized that endless toil could destroy the very virtues he sought to cultivate. Without rest, the mind dulled, judgment faltered, and the capacity for goodness weakened. Franklin respected the body's need for sleep, aiming for 7 hours each night. He called sleep the best of physicians, a quiet healer that restored strength and clarity. His evenings of reflection prepared him for rest, allowing him to sleep without the burden of unexamined guilt. By valuing sleep, he acknowledged that rest was not idleness but maintenance, as vital as labor itself. Rest also came in smaller forms. Pauses in the day to converse, to walk, to read, to play music. These were restorations as well. They refreshed his spirit and kept his balance steady. Franklin understood that to press forward without pause was to court collapse. By weaving moments of rest into his routine, He ensured that work remained fruitful, that curiosity remained sharp, that virtue remained attainable. He treated rest not as indulgence, but as nourishment, the soil in which labor could grow. Virtue was the thread that tied work and rest together. Franklin's list of 13 virtues was not a decoration. It was a daily guide. Industry encouraged him to use time well, frugality to avoid waste, sincerity to keep truth in speech, justice to consider others, tranquility to keep his mind calm. Each virtue supported the balance of his routine. Without industry, he might have drifted into idleness. Without tranquility, his industry might have hardened into restlessness. Without sincerity and justice, his work might have served only himself. Virtue ensured that his balance was moral as well as practical, that his life was measured not only in achievements, but in character that he admitted, often, that he failed to keep these virtues perfectly. His charts were filled with marks of imperfection, reminders that he was as human as any other. But he did not despair at these failings. Instead, he saw them as part of the balance, a signal that correction was needed, that rest from one pursuit might restore another. The very act of keeping the chart was itself a practice of balance, a way of holding himself accountable without falling into self-condemnation. Franklin also believed that balance extended to relationships. He knew that no man lived for himself alone, and so he sought harmony between private and public duties. He worked for his business, but he also worked for his city, helping to establish libraries, fire brigades, and schools. He cared for his household, but also for his apprentices and colleagues. He believed that a life out of balance, one devoted entirely to private gain or entirely to public service, would eventually collapse. The balance of self and others, of household and community, was as important as the balance of work and rest. The discipline of his daily schedule reflected this philosophy. Rising early, working steadily, pausing for reading and conversation, ending with reflection, all were parts of a cycle designed to keep his life in balance. Each day was like a wheel turning. Intention in the morning, action in the afternoon, reflection in the evening, renewal in the night. The cycle repeated, not perfectly, but with persistence. Balance, for Franklin, was not a static achievement, but a dynamic practice, maintained by returning again and again to the rhythm of the day. Looking back, we see how this balance shaped his life. Without work, he could not have achieved his inventions, writings, or public projects. Without rest, he could not have sustained them. Without virtue, they would not have carried the weight of moral meaning that gave them lasting value. Together, they made his life not only productive but harmonious, a model of how to live fully without being consumed by any single pursuit. For those who study his routine today, the lesson is both simple and profound. The balance of work, rest, and virtue is not reserved for the extraordinary. It is built from ordinary choices, to rise with intention, to work with focus, to pause with gratitude, to rest with trust. Franklin's greatness did not come from a life free of error, but from a life shaped by this continual balancing, this willingness to adjust, to return, to steady himself upon the path of improvement. As the wheel of Franklin's day turned, each part gave meaning to the others. Work without rest would have become drudgery. Rest without virtue would have become idleness. Virtue without action would have become empty. But together, they formed a harmony that carried him not only through his days but into history, remembered not only for what he achieved but for how he lived. Benjamin Franklin's life was never meant to be confined to the narrow walls of a print shop or the quiet space of private reflection. As his reputation grew, his sense of responsibility widened. He did not see himself merely as a tradesman, a writer, or even an inventor, but as a citizen in the fullest sense of the word, one whose routine must, at least in part, serve the needs of the society around him. For Franklin, personal discipline was inseparable from public duty. The hours he invested in service to the community became extensions of the same philosophy that governed his mornings and evenings: to ask what good he could do, and then to act upon it. His routine as a public man began in much the same way as before, with careful structure. Yet increasingly, his daily hours were claimed by civic responsibilities. Philadelphia in the 18th century was a growing city, bustling with trade and yet vulnerable to disorder, fire, poverty, and lack of infrastructure. Franklin looked around and saw not problems to complain about, but opportunities for improvement. Each gap in the fabric of the city was, to him, an invitation to contribute. And so he wove his public service into his daily routine, ensuring that every week contained time set aside not just for self, but for society. One of Franklin's earliest acts of civic-mindedness was the establishment of a subscription library. He recognized that books were costly and often inaccessible to ordinary tradesmen and apprentices. Knowledge, in his view, should not be the property of the few but the nourishment of the many. So he and his friends pooled resources, creating the Library Company of Philadelphia. This was not a sudden act of charity, but a practical response to a daily observation that men thirsted for learning but lacked the means. By organizing his companions into a cooperative, Franklin translated his private love of books into a public resource. The rhythm of his day soon included not only his own reading, but the administration of a library that fed the minds of others. Fire was another danger that shaped his public routine. In an age before organized fire brigades, blazes could destroy entire neighborhoods in minutes. Franklin saw the destruction such fires caused, and he resolved to act. He helped establish the Union Fire Company, one of the first volunteer fire brigades in the colonies. He himself joined the watch, carrying buckets and tools when alarms sounded. His daily discipline of industry now extended into nights when flames lit the sky, his sense of duty binding him to neighbors in moments of crisis. In this way, even emergencies were folded into his rhythm of service, reminders that a citizen's responsibility did not end when his shop closed. Franklin's civic vision extended to health and safety as well. He recognized that Philadelphia lacked proper paving, lighting, and sanitation. Streets became muddy in rain, dangerous at night, and unhealthy with refuse. Instead of waiting for others to act, Franklin used his skill as a writer and organizer to rally his fellow citizens. He proposed systems for street cleaning, advocated for paving stones, and pressed for public lamps to bring safety after dark. Each initiative demanded meetings, discussions, and planning, hours carved from his schedule, willingly surrendered to the common good. His time was no longer his own alone, but belonged to the city he loved. As his influence grew, Franklin also became deeply involved in education. He believed that learning should not end with basic literacy, but should extend into practical knowledge that served society. He helped found the Academy of Philadelphia, which would later become the University of Pennsylvania. Here again, his routine reflected his philosophy. Just as his mornings began with questions of goodness, his public hours were devoted to building institutions that answered those questions on a larger scale. Each project he undertook was like a stone laid in the foundation of a stronger community, and his schedule became the mortar binding them together. Franklin's time as a public man also carried him into political life. He served in the Pennsylvania Assembly, represented his colony in London, and eventually played a crucial role in shaping a new nation. But even in these grander arenas, his devotion to routine remained. He did not see politics as spectacle, but as an extension of his daily habits: listening, reflecting, proposing, and improving. In committee meetings, he brought the same patience he brought to his print shop. In debates, he favored clarity over flourish, simplicity over excess. His effectiveness lay not in fiery speeches, but in steady presence, a continuation of the same discipline that structured his private life. What is striking in all of this is how Franklin did not abandon his personal habits when public duty increased. Instead, he folded them together. The chart he kept of virtues still guided him, reminding him to seek balance even in the midst of politics. His evenings of reflection still ended with the same question: what good have I done today? The answer, increasingly, pointed not only to private actions but to public contributions: a fire prevented, a law improved, a library sustained, a student encouraged. His life became a testimony to the idea that public service need not be a sacrifice of personal integrity, but its fulfillment. In his public routine, Franklin also modeled a spirit of cooperation. He did not impose his ideas by force, but invited others to join. He believed that improvement came not from isolated effort, but from shared endeavor. Whether forming a fire company, a library, or a learned society, he always created space for others to contribute. This cooperative spirit reflected his conviction that virtue was not solitary but communal, that a balanced life required bonds with others as much as self-discipline. His time was therefore multiplied, each hour joined with the hours of his companions, yielding results no single man could achieve. The rhythm of Franklin's public life carried lessons that stretched beyond his century. He demonstrated that citizenship is not a title but a practice, measured not by occasional grand gestures, but by daily acts of care. To sweep a street, to light a lamp, to organize a library, to join a brigade, these were not small things, but the steady work of building society. In giving his time to such tasks, Franklin revealed the power of routine in shaping not only a man but a community. Looking back, it is clear that Franklin's greatest inventions were not only stoves or spectacles, but institutions. He invented ways of living together, ways of supporting one another, ways of sharing knowledge and responsibility. These inventions were built not in workshops, but in the schedules of his days, in the hours he devoted to meetings, letters, planning, and action. They were the fruit of a routine that always asked, what good can be done now? And who can join me in doing it? And so, Franklin's time as a public man was not a departure from his private discipline, but its flowering. The balance of work, rest, and virtue now extended to the balance of self and society, of personal improvement and public service. His daily question, carried into the broader world, became the engine of institutions that endure to this day. His life reminds us that to serve others is not to lose oneself, but to fulfill the deepest intentions of a disciplined routine. The days of Franklin's public life stretched into years. The pattern held steady: mornings of intention, afternoons of work and service, evenings of reflection. In the end, his legacy was not only what he achieved, but how he lived, a life where personal discipline and public duty were bound together, hour by hour, day by day. Benjamin Franklin's daily routine was more than a schedule. It was a philosophy. Beneath the lists of hours, the questions of goodness, and the steady rhythm of work and reflection lay a deeper conviction. That time itself was the most precious resource a human being possessed. Franklin saw time as the true currency of life, more valuable than silver or gold, more fleeting than paper or property. To waste time was, in his eyes, to squander existence. To use it wisely was to honor life itself. This belief shaped every detail of his days, from the way he rose with intention in the morning to the way he measured his virtues at night. Franklin often wrote about the value of time. In his essays and aphorisms, he returned again and again to the theme that lost time is never found again. Money, he argued, could be gained, lost, and regained, but time once spent was gone forever. This view was not merely rhetorical. It was practical. It guided his choices in business, invention, and civic life. If a meeting was unnecessary, he sought to shorten it. If a task could be done more efficiently, he sought to improve it. If hours slipped by in idleness, he regarded them as opportunities wasted. He treated each day as a ledger, with time as the account to be managed, not out of anxiety, but out of respect for the gift of life. His charts of virtues reflected this philosophy. Industry, the careful use of time, was central among them. He tracked whether he had squandered hours in distraction, whether he had applied himself fully to useful pursuits. Yet Franklin did not define usefulness narrowly. Time spent reading, conversing, inventing, or even resting could all count as good if they contributed to growth, wisdom, or well-being. What mattered was not constant motion, but meaningful motion, not busyness for its own sake, but purpose. This distinction reveals Franklin's subtlety. He knew that overwork could be as wasteful as idleness if it lacked direction. For Franklin, time also carried a moral dimension. To waste one's own time was regrettable. To waste the time of others was unjust. He urged punctuality in meetings and correspondence, not out of vanity, but out of respect. If others gave him their hours, he believed he owed them value in return. His sense of justice extended to time itself, making him attentive not only to his own schedule, but to the schedules of those around him. He sought efficiency not simply for profit, but to honor the shared currency of hours. This philosophy also shaped his inventions. The Franklin stove was not only about warmth. It was about saving time and labor in gathering fuel. Bifocals were not only about vision. They were about reducing the wasted effort of switching glasses. His proposals for street lighting and paving were not only about convenience. They were about preventing accidents and delays, preserving time for citizens. Even his experiments with electricity reflected a curiosity about harnessing natural forces to serve human needs more efficiently. Invention, for Franklin, was often the art of rescuing time from unnecessary waste. Franklin's respect for time made him wary of procrastination. He observed how easily people deferred tasks, convincing themselves that tomorrow would suffice. But tomorrow, he knew, carried no guarantees. By acting today, he ensured progress. By delaying, he risked losing opportunities forever. This urgency did not make him frantic, but deliberate. He approached tasks steadily, preferring consistent effort to rushed frenzy. His life embodied his own advice. You may delay, but time will not. And yet, Franklin's philosophy of time was not harsh. He did not demand endless work without pause. He recognized that leisure, rest, and reflection were not wastes of time, but essential uses of it. An hour spent in honest conversation, in music, or in walking outdoors could be as valuable as an hour at the press or in committee. The key was intention. If an activity refreshed the mind, strengthened the body, deepened friendship, or fostered virtue, it was a good investment of time. If it dulled, distracted, or degraded, it was waste. Franklin's wisdom lay in discerning the difference. This perspective also shaped his view of aging. As he grew older, Franklin became acutely aware that his time was finite. Rather than lament this fact, he used it as motivation. Each year reminded him of the importance of using hours well. He wrote, invented, and served with a sense that the days left to him were precious, not to be frittered away. This acceptance of mortality gave his routine urgency without despair, purpose without fear. Time's limits, to Franklin, were not a curse but a call to live fully. Franklin also saw time as collective. He believed that societies, like individuals, had their seasons, and that wasted years could delay progress for generations. This belief drove his civic projects. A school founded today could educate tomorrow's leaders. A fire brigade organized now could prevent losses for decades. A newspaper printed this week could shape debate for years to come. By giving his time to such endeavors, Franklin sought to multiply it, to ensure that the hours he invested would ripple outward long after he was gone. His routine as a public man, therefore, was a way of lending his time to the future, of spending his own hours so that others might gain theirs. Perhaps the most striking element of Franklin's philosophy of time was its gentleness. Though he spoke of time as precious, he did not demand perfection. He forgave himself when he failed, began again each morning, and treated life as a continual experiment. He did not expect to master time, but to honor it. This humility kept him from rigidity, allowing him to adapt, to enjoy, to rest, to laugh. In his hands, time was not a tyrant but a companion, urging him onward but also teaching him patience. Looking back, Franklin's understanding of time feels both practical and profound. He recognized its economic value, its moral weight, its personal urgency, and its collective power. He used charts and schedules, inventions and institutions, reflections and questions, all to ensure that time was spent well. Yet he also embraced imperfection, knowing that no life could be free of wasted moments. His greatness lay not in erasing all waste, but in continually returning to intention, in asking each morning and each evening what good could be done with the hours given. And so, Franklin's routine was more than habit. It was philosophy embodied. Time was the currency of life, and he spent it with care. He invested in himself, in others, in his city, in his nation. He treated each day as a coin placed upon the table of history, not hoarded, not squandered, but used. In doing so, he left behind a legacy measured not only in inventions, writings, and institutions, but in the example of a life lived with respect for time. Benjamin Franklin's life did not remain within the quiet streets of Philadelphia. As his reputation grew, he was called beyond the familiar rhythms of his print shop, beyond the circle of his Junto Club, and beyond the early morning walks to his library or civic meetings. Duty carried him across the ocean, first to London and later to Paris, where he would serve as the colony's representative and, later, as one of the key figures securing alliances that shaped the future of a new nation. These journeys abroad brought new challenges, new cultures, and new expectations. Yet, even in foreign lands, Franklin sought to hold onto the framework of his daily routine. His mornings and evenings, his devotion to balance, his philosophy of time. These became anchors in the shifting seas of diplomacy and travel when Franklin arrived in London in the mid-18th century. He entered a city of vast size and noise compared to Philadelphia. The streets bustled with carriages, apprentices, beggars, merchants, and lords. Coffee houses hummed with debate. Newspapers multiplied by the dozens. The air was heavy with smoke and commerce. For a man used to the measured pace of colonial life, London might have seemed overwhelming. Yet Franklin did not lose himself in the chaos. He carried with him the same habit of rising early, asking his morning question, and tending to his day with order. In rented lodgings or the homes of friends, he carved space for study, correspondence, and reflection, just as he had in his own home. London also provided Franklin with opportunities that suited his love of conversation and curiosity. He frequented coffee houses, where men of all ranks gathered to discuss politics, science, and trade. These gatherings reminded him of his own Junto, though on a much larger scale. Here, too, he practiced his routine of improvement through dialogue. His leisure hours became filled with spirited debates about philosophy and science, exchanges that sharpened his thought and expanded his network. In this way, Franklin's leisure abroad was not idle but intentional, an extension of his daily discipline applied to new contexts, even while immersed in London life. Franklin sought to maintain his virtue charts and reflections. Letters from this period reveal his continued concern with self-improvement, his attempts to keep order amidst the whirl of obligations. The question of goodness did not vanish simply because he was far from home. If anything, it grew sharper, for he felt himself representing not only his own reputation, but that of his colony. Each action, each meeting, each word spoken in Parliament or in private circles became part of his duty. His routine was tested, but it endured, reshaped to fit the demands of diplomacy. Paris, years later, brought an even greater test. By the time Franklin arrived in France in 1776, he was 70 years old, his body marked by age, his hair turned white, his health sometimes fragile. Yet he was received like a celebrity. The French adored him, charmed by his wit, his modest dress, and his air of wisdom. In salons lit by chandeliers, in gardens scented with roses, in drawing rooms crowded with aristocrats, Franklin became the center of attention. For many, he was a symbol of the new world itself, plain in clothing, profound in thought, practical in manner, and touched with a kind of rustic nobility. The whirl of Parisian life could have swept away any routine. Invitations arrived daily. Admirers pressed upon him. The politics of alliances demanded endless meetings and correspondence. Yet Franklin still held to his structure. He rose early whenever possible, though his health sometimes required more rest. He read, wrote letters, and asked his guiding question of goodness. He ended his evenings with reflection, often recording his thoughts or quietly conversing with trusted friends. Amid the glitter of French society, he sought tranquility, maintaining the rhythm that had sustained him for decades. One of the most remarkable aspects of Franklin's time abroad was his ability to adapt his routine without abandoning it. He recognized that in Paris, diplomacy often happened not in official chambers, but at dinners, salons, and even masquerade balls. To refuse these invitations would have been to refuse the very arena in which influence was exercised. And so, Franklin adapted. He treated these gatherings as part of his civic duty, part of the good he could do in the day. But he carried into them the same principles he carried into his mornings: sincerity, humility, wit, and respect for time. He charmed without vanity, listened as much as he spoke, and used leisure as a tool for diplomacy. His routine became flexible, bending without breaking, holding its core even as circumstances shifted. In his letters from Paris, Franklin often mentioned his longing for the simpler rhythms of home. Yet he never complained bitterly. He accepted that life abroad was different, that his hours would not always be his own, but he still returned to reflection each evening. He still measured his days by the standard of goodness, asking whether he had advanced the cause of his country, whether he had honored his virtues, whether he had invested his time wisely. Even in the grandest courts of Europe, the candlelit notebook remained, a quiet reminder of Philadelphia's habits carried across the ocean. Travel itself shaped his routine in other ways. The journey across the Atlantic was long and uncertain, lasting weeks, sometimes months. Aboard ships, Franklin kept to his habits as best he could. He read, wrote, observed the sea, and experimented with the motion of waves or the behavior of storms. His curiosity never slept. Even in the confinement of a cabin, he turned leisure into learning. When weather forced rest, he accepted it as part of the balance between effort and patience. The ocean tested his endurance, but also gave him time for contemplation, for long stretches of thought uninterrupted by the bustle of land. That Franklin's ability to maintain routine abroad reveals the strength of his philosophy. A man who sees time as currency, who grounds his life in questions of goodness, who balances work, rest, and virtue. Such a man carries his structure with him wherever he goes. Place matters less than principle. Lodgings in London, salons in Paris, cabins at sea, all became stages upon which his routine played out, adapted but enduring. This constancy gave him resilience, allowing him to thrive in environments that would have unsettled many. Looking back, Franklin's time abroad shows that routine is not about rigid control, but about inner steadiness. He did not insist on recreating Philadelphia in Paris. He allowed himself to experience the new culture fully, but he carried within him a compass, a rhythm that guided his steps. Mornings of intention, days of labor and conversation, evenings of reflection, these patterns traveled with him, giving coherence to a life stretched across continents. And so, Franklin abroad was still Franklin at home. The surroundings changed, the languages shifted, the obligations multiplied, but the heart of his routine remained. He asked each morning what good he could do. He spent his hours in purposeful activity, whether printing in Philadelphia, debating in London, or charming in Paris. He ended each evening by asking what good he had done. The questions carried him through, weaving together a life of remarkable consistency in the midst of remarkable change. When Benjamin Franklin closed his eyes for the last time in April of 1790, the rhythms of his daily routine did not vanish with him. They lingered, carried forward in the writings he left behind, in the institutions he founded, and in the memories of those who knew him. His schedule of rising early, working steadily, reflecting honestly, and resting with intention became more than a private habit. It became a model, a legacy of discipline and balance that offered lessons to a new nation struggling to define itself. Franklin's daily life was not merely personal, it was instructive. A silent teacher reminding generations that greatness is built hour by hour, day by day, on the quiet foundations of routine. Franklin had always understood that his routine was not only for himself. By publishing his autobiography, he deliberately shared his method of self-improvement, including his charts of virtues, his structured days, and his guiding questions. Readers across America, and later the world, studied these pages not as abstract philosophy, but as practical instruction. They saw how a boy who once ran away from Boston with little more than ambition had, through discipline, risen to become a printer, inventor, statesman, and philosopher. They saw that his success was not a gift of fortune, but the product of habits anyone could attempt to cultivate. In this way, Franklin's daily routine became democratized, available to all who sought improvement. One of the greatest lessons Franklin passed to the young nation was the belief that time is the true wealth of a people. He warned against idleness, not because he scorned leisure, but because he saw how wasted hours weakened both individuals and communities. For a republic to thrive, its citizens needed to value their time, to use it wisely in labor, learning, and civic duty. His oft-quoted sayings, "Time is money, lost time is never found again," were more than maxims. They were reminders that a free people, unlike subjects under a king, carried the responsibility of shaping their own destiny. Franklin's personal discipline became a political philosophy. A nation that squandered its time would squander its freedom. The institutions Franklin left behind embodied this lesson. The Library Company of Philadelphia taught citizens to use their hours in reading and study. The fire brigades taught them to devote time to the safety of neighbors. The Postal Service, which Franklin organized, taught them to value efficiency in communication. The University of Pennsylvania taught them to invest time in education. Each institution was, in its way, a reflection of his routine, orderly, purposeful, oriented toward improvement. They extended his hours into the future, allowing others to benefit from the time he had spent in thought and labor. Franklin's legacy also shaped the work ethic of early America. His emphasis on industry and frugality resonated deeply with a society carving a life from wilderness and striving for independence. Farmers rising at dawn, merchants balancing their accounts, apprentices learning their trades, all found in Franklin a voice that affirmed their daily struggles. He elevated ordinary labor into virtue, reminding people that their hours were not insignificant, but the building blocks of prosperity and progress. This outlook helped define the emerging national character, blending practicality with ambition, discipline with creativity. But Franklin's legacy of routine was not limited to labor. He also taught the importance of balance. He warned against overindulgence, against allowing industry to become restlessness or ambition to become greed. His charts of virtues revealed his awareness that discipline must be tempered with humanity. He admitted his failures, showed his imperfections, and encouraged others not to despair at theirs. In doing so, he passed on a model of improvement that was humble, forgiving, and realistic. The young nation, too, would stumble and fail, but like Franklin, it could rise each morning with a renewed question: what good shall we do today? Franklin's reflections on rest and leisure also influenced those who came after him. By showing that hours of reading, music, conversation, and even simple walks could enrich life as much as labor, he reminded people that a well-ordered routine is not a chain, but a harmony. This view softened the harsher edges of early American work ethic, balancing diligence with joy. Generations who read his words learned that virtue was not only in toil, but also in the thoughtful enjoyment of life, in curiosity pursued for its own sake, in laughter shared with friends. Even in politics, Franklin's routine left its mark. His habit of listening before speaking, of reflecting before acting, became an example to leaders in an age often marked by fiery rhetoric and hasty decisions. His patience in negotiations, his willingness to compromise, and his calm presence in stormy debates all reflected the habits he had cultivated in daily life. The same man who balanced his hours on paper balanced the competing demands of colonies and nations, helping to craft documents and treaties that required steady hands and steady minds. His personal routine became a national asset, guiding the Republic through uncertain beginnings. Perhaps the most enduring lesson Franklin offered was the idea that improvement is continual. He never claimed to have mastered his virtues or perfected his schedule. He showed, instead, that life itself is a long experiment, that discipline is a process rather than a product. This humility gave his example lasting appeal. People did not see in Franklin a flawless hero, but a fellow traveler who struggled, corrected himself, and tried again. His legacy of routine was not a rigid formula, but a flexible guide, adaptable to changing times and circumstances. In this adaptability lay its power, for each generation could take Franklin's principles and shape them to its own needs. Looking back, we can see how Franklin's daily habits seeped into the fabric of a nation. His mornings of intention inspired citizens to greet their days with purpose. His afternoons of labor encouraged them to work with diligence. His evenings of reflection taught them to measure life not by wealth or fame, but by goodness. His balance of work, rest, and virtue reminded them that prosperity and morality must walk together. His respect for time taught them that every hour mattered, that history itself is written in the ledger of days. And so, Franklin's legacy of routine is more than biography. It is philosophy made flesh, a vision of life lived deliberately. The young nation, watching and reading him, absorbed these lessons into its culture, carrying them forward into its schools, its businesses, its politics, and its homes. To this day, when we speak of self-discipline, of time management, of civic responsibility, we echo Franklin's voice. His daily routine, once a private chart in a notebook, has become part of the shared wisdom of a people that in the end. Franklin's greatest gift was not an invention, a pamphlet, or even a treaty. It was the example of a life lived with intention, a life in which hours were honored, virtues pursued, and balance sought. His legacy teaches us that history is not only made in great moments, but in the quiet turning of days, in the discipline of routine, in the humble yet powerful question, what good shall I do today? As the quiet of evening settles, and the long arc of Benjamin Franklin's days comes gently to rest, we can look back and see the pattern of a life not ruled by chance, but by intention. His mornings began with a question, what good shall I do today? His afternoons unfolded with labor, invention, and service. His evenings closed with reflection, what good have I done today? Between those questions stretched the rhythm of a man who treated hours as treasures, who believed that time itself was the true wealth of life, that Franklin's greatness did not lie only in inventions, discoveries, or diplomacy. It lived in the way he shaped his days, in the steady balance of work and rest, in the devotion to virtue, in the patience of improvement. He showed that history is not only written in revolutions and treaties, but also in the quiet turning of mornings and evenings, in habits repeated faithfully, in choices made with care. His routine was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary, because it consisted of the simple acts any person might do: waking early, reading, working, reflecting. Extraordinary, because he infused those acts with purpose, treating them as tools of growth, as steps toward goodness, as parts of a larger harmony. By living deliberately, he transformed the common hours of life into a legacy that outlived him, shaping not only his own character but the character of a nation. Tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine Franklin at his desk, pen in hand, candle burning low, charting his virtues, asking his simple questions. Picture him walking through the streets of Philadelphia, greeting neighbors, organizing libraries and fire brigades, pausing to observe the world with curiosity. Picture him in Paris salons, in London coffee houses, aboard ships at sea, always carrying his routine with him, always steady, always thoughtful. His life was not a string of accidents, but a circle carefully drawn, closed each day with reflection, renewed each morning with hope. And so, the story of Benjamin Franklin's daily routine is not only his story. It is an invitation to each of us, a whisper across centuries, reminding us that time is precious, that days are opportunities, that even small habits shape great legacies. To rise with purpose, to labor with care, to rest with gratitude, to reflect with honesty. This is the rhythm he left behind. A rhythm we can still hear if we listen closely. Now let the rhythm of his days settle softly into your own thoughts. Let the calm of his evenings guide you into rest. And as sleep approaches, you may carry with you his gentle question, one that lingers as both comfort and challenge. What good shall I do tomorrow?